Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I'm Rupa Subramanya. Thank you for tuning in once again. It's great to have you back. It's now just over 3 years since the world plunged into the COVID-19 crisis and the harsh pandemic policies that were put in place by many governments around the world, including here in Canada. Measures such as harsh lockdowns, masking, and social distancing requirements, and of course, the vaccine mandates. My guest today is a prominent voice who has come out as a critic of such policies. Gabrielle Bauer is a medical journalist and has just published a book called Blindsight is 2020, and it's a real honor to have her on the show to discuss her book. Gabrielle, welcome to the show. It's a real honor to have you on my show to talk about your new book. Blindsight is 2020, published by Brownstone Institute. For those of you tuning in, I encourage you all to get a copy. It's about the pandemic, what went wrong, and it's a real honor to have you on the show, Gabrielle.
I'll show you the book here. There it is.
Blindsight is 2020. There you have it. Gabrielle, let me start by asking you. So 3 years ago, much of the world, with the exception of countries like Sweden, went into harsh lockdowns, and soon we'd be facing harsh vaccine mandates and mask mandates and other restrictions on our individual liberties that were unprecedented in peacetime. Given your background as a medical journalist, what motivated you to write Blindsight is 2020?
Well, it's a long story and I guess an organic story. When the lockdowns hit, I was in Brazil visiting friends, and that was a whole story in itself, getting back to Toronto. But basically, from day one, and I literally mean day one, that the lockdowns were announced, I had a visceral recoil to the whole thing. And I spent the next 3 years trying to understand it and trying to connect with like-minded people and really trying to get deep into, why did this bother me? Why were all my associates and friends and colleagues, why were they so gung-ho about this? More than gung-ho, why were they so militant? Why were they so eager to shame any dissenting views? What was going on? Was something wrong with me? I briefly wondered about that. Why am I not on board with this? And so this took me on this journey, completely unexpected journey. I was 63 when this happened. I'm 66 now. So I'm kind of in the demographic that you would expect to be, to want the protection. But I didn't want this type of protection. It really did not sit well with me. And so I felt a very strong need to connect with like-minded people, both professionals and lay people. I ended up joining a Reddit group called Lockdown Skepticism that's still active with 55,000+ people, and then eventually forming a Toronto group that we call QLIT, Questioning Lockdowns in Toronto. And we had a very active WhatsApp group, and we had meetups, and somehow this was vitally important because I felt so unmoored and so alienated, like what was going on with this world and why were people okay with this? So eventually I read and took notes, and I had no idea I was going to write a book and kept links and all that stuff, but it all kind of coalesced once I started writing for the Brownstone Institute, and then I think they were happy with the quality of my writing, and then I pitched a book to them, and they agreed to publish it. And so that's what happened, and it was published earlier this year. And it's kind of a different book. I've read a lot of pandemic books too, and I can talk about that later. This one is a little bit different.
Sure, yeah. Could you explain to us this, what I find the somewhat enigmatic title of your book? I know what it means to be blindsided, but what do you mean by blindsight? Which seems to be a coinage of yours.
Yeah, I mean it's a play on hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
So blindsight is, I guess, intended to mean lack of hindsight. So instead of having hindsight, the world had blindsight. It didn't see properly. And then
Mm-hmm.
2020 is also a pun because it's the 2020 vision, but it's also the
Exactly.
year
Yeah.
2020. So it's kind of a double pun, I guess.
Yeah, well, no, it's a very interesting title, and in your book, you're very obviously very critical of the mantra that we kept hearing: follow the science, trust our experts. Can you explain why this was absolute nonsense, and why and why science per se doesn't give us a singular message on what our response to the pandemic ought to be?
That's so true. That's so true. And so few people realize that.
Yeah, the science is contested, right? And we were fed this singular narrative by our political leaders, scientists, and the media.
Well, it's not just, yes, obviously that's part of it. Science is contested and constantly evolving. That's a part of it. But another part of it, kind of a more philosophical part, is science is not prescriptive. Science does not tell you what to do. Even if the science is perfect, even if we knew exactly, what's going to make the virus spread more and spread less, that doesn't tell us what to do for humans. Science, tells us what is, not what we ought to do. And what we ought to do depends not just on viral propagation properties, on or areas under the curve or anything like that. It depends on what's best for humanity as a whole, and that takes psychological, economical, social, historical, spiritual, all those considerations into account. So, the way I say it briefly is what's best for the virus is not necessarily what's best for humanity. But there was this tacit assumption that whatever the science, says we should be doing to stop the spread or eliminate the virus is what we should do as humans. And the two things are not the same, not necessarily the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, scholars such as Jay Bhattacharya, whom I've had on the show as well, he's been very critical of, throughout the pandemic, consistently critical on the negative impact of lockdowns and school closures, and of course, as a scientist, he was seen as a dissenting voice. He was seen as beyond the pale.
I've had the pleasure of meeting him actually in person and on Zoom.
Yeah, no, he is wonderful, and he's incredibly encouraging and supportive of other dissenting voices, and and is an incredibly down to earth person as well. Could you, and he helped set up the Great Barrington Declaration. Could you tell us about the significance of the declaration and the harmful effect of lockdowns?
Well, it was interesting because when I first found out about the Great Barrington Declaration, the day that it was, October 4th, the very day, I signed it right away, and a lot of people signed it. And then the signatures, you could just see them because I followed the count of signatures. It sort of went along this, very steep curve, and then it just petered out very suddenly, because what happened was suddenly the mainstream media got a hold of it and started lambasting it, maligning it, and then people stopped signing. So it was initially, for the first few days, really popular. A lot of scientists and lay people were really on board. And then it just stopped. As I say, it got so smeared, so unbelievably smeared in the mainstream media. But what's also interesting is before the Great Barrington Declaration, there were a lot of similar open letters from various governments or from various, stakeholder groups to governments, I think in Belgium and Austria and Israel and France. I can't remember all the countries, but I remember in that summer of 2020, there were a lot of other grassroots groups in countries that were they were saying, wait a minute, this is crazy. The world has gone nuts. But for some reason, those other letters did not gain traction. And the Great Barrington Declaration did, even though it was slammed. It got the world's attention. So I think in that sense, it was a real success, even though the recommendations were ultimately not followed. It still got the world's attention, and it changed the conversation.
It did, and it's unfortunate, as you point out, you saw a lot of people signing onto the declaration, and then it just petered out because people, some of these scientists and other experts just perhaps were just afraid to attach their name to something that was seen as controversial or anti-science, or and they were they would have been publicly shamed. I mean, what does that say about the state of academic freedom, independent thinking, especially when it comes to the scientific community? Because if dissent is not appreciated there, if critical thinking is not encouraged there, what hope do we have of this happening in other disciplines, in other areas of our lives?
Absolutely. I think what happened, and I talk about that a lot in the book, because my book is less about science than about the philosophy and the morality. I think there was this moral cloak that descended on the whole thing. This sort of stay home, save lives. And this idea that if we even think about letting some infection happen, if we don't just focus on suppress, maximum suppression, that somehow we are, doing something morally wrong. And that was very powerful. And people latched onto that. I think the mainstream latched onto this idea of this moral outrage at the idea that there could be a scientifically sound policy that does not involve maximum suppression, that involves a balance between letting some infection happen in order to build some population immunity and protecting the vulnerable. I think there was, as I say, I could sense the Overton window of morality just shifting with COVID like crazy. And you couldn't talk about these things. I mean, I know it because when I tried to talk about any of it online, like I got insults the likes of that I've never seen in my entire life, being called, and this was par for the course. Anyone, as Jay will tell you as well, I mean, he got death threats. Anyone who dared to question it. I think, again, there was this groupthink, this sort of outrage, moral, people just got themselves worked up into this moral lather such that you could not have civilized and sane discussions about any of it. We sort of forget how it was now, but it was pretty bad.
I mean, that kind of behavior has manifested itself in, sure, the pandemic is behind us to a large extent, but it's manifested in other areas of our lives. Like, I mean, I've interviewed guests who have, who oppose gender ideology, for example, and I know when they speak out, and I just interviewed a detransitioner, a very prominent detransitioner from the U.S. this morning, and she's been ostracized, and and she's only 18, and it's incredible how young people, like teenagers, people in high school, are being canceled and publicly shamed and derided and bullied by.
I know there's no space for nuanced discussions. It's
no,
and I'd never experienced this. As I say, I was 63 when this started. No one had called me a sociopath or a mouth breathing Trump tard or a village idiot before, and then that's in 2020, those are the insults that I received.
I mean, what do you think was going on here? I mean, I've asked this question to several people I've interviewed, on what went wrong with and how we handled the pandemic, and fear obviously was an important component. You had authorities who latched on to the idea that they could propagate this fear as much as possible. The media had a role to play. I mean, the media saw its role as as being moralistic, pushing this moralistic line on the rest of us. And you had a scientific community that was advocating for, not the entire scientific community, but those scientists advocating for a zero COVID policy. Obviously, their goals were in line with governments who want more control, who want to exercise more control over our lives. So it was like the perfect storm, in a sense, or the perfect meeting of three different things happening here, which I believe, led to this unfortunate situation where any kind of dissent was seen as sacrilegious and, and enough to, ostracize you.
Yeah. It's funny because I know that there are some people, like, the Brownstone writers community is a very heterogeneous group. We communicate a lot by email, and there are some people who are, I hate to use the word conspiracy because the word has been kind of overused and misused, but there are some people who are more inclined than I am to suspect sort of planning or malfeasance from the very beginning. For that, to me, that's a stretch. That has always been a stretch, because it's not just in the US or in the UK or in Canada this happened. This happened all over the world. And the idea that there's just a few puppeteers kind of getting all these politically, and economically disparate countries with different goals to do the same thing, to me, it's a stretch.
Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. Yeah, no, I'm no fan of that organization or Mr. Schwab, and I do think that I think they do have nefarious objectives, I'm not and I try to tell people that this grand conspiracy of this one guy sitting in the Swiss Alps getting together all of these people, and like he's like the Bond villain or something, just seems a bit of a stretch. Yeah, for sure.
But I agree that there was certainly malfeasance along the way, and certainly the idea that there was a crisis, and so political actors who wanted greater control saw the opportunity to grab it. But I to me, the whole thing is kind of explainable with the two psychological forces that I discuss in chapters 2 and 3 of my book, which is fear and groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
Matthias Desmet,
of course, yes,
proponent of the groupthink, which he called mass formation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of historical precedent for that. I mean, groupthink is a deep psychological force in humanity. And so to me, the combination of fear and groupthink, and then, yes, a media that instead of pushing back and interrogating government just became their puppets, that explains a lot. So that's kind of where I land now. I'm willing to change my mind if new facts emerge, but that doesn't mean that I excuse any of it. I certainly excuse the media for, as I say, for not doing their job of interrogating policy rather than just going to it.
Yeah, no, I can tell you I was incredibly skeptical of lockdowns, and I argued against lockdowns from the beginning. But something happened to me when it came to the vaccine mandates. I just, a year and a half later, I just found myself saying that we need vaccine mandates. That didn't last for too long, because then I realized, it was just a bad mistake on my part, and then since then I've just been arguing against it. And
well, it's interesting. It's very similar to me. I don't think there's too many of us. I was also, when I started out, I just saw vaccine mandates as initially not that different from school vaccine mandates. And I had my kids vaccinated. There was even more vaccines than required. Never have, definitely I was pro-vaccine. But as I interviewed bioethicists for my book, and I learned more about the nuances, and I came to realize that, yes, this is different, because previous vaccine mandates, even the smallpox mandates, did not put people in the position of having to choose jab or job. The penalty for not getting vaccinated was much more lenient, milder. So this degree of coercion, I don't think we've ever seen that before. And that's where it really violated basic principles of bodily autonomy. And then, of course, we all watched Prime Minister Trudeau go completely nuts with, no matter what you, in mid-2021, no matter what you asked him, I don't know, how are the Ottawa Senators doing? Let's get all Canadians vaccinated.
Yeah.
That was his answer to everything.
No, absolutely. I do remember that quite well. And it was, and the trauma of those who refuse to get vaccinated, it's still very visible. I can see that people are still, not over that, and it's incredible how divisive that whole that whole part of the pandemic was, and and the most visible manifestation of public discontent, whether it related to these harsh lockdowns or whether it related to the vaccine mandates, no jab, no job, was of course the Freedom Convoy. And you referred to my writing of the convoy in your book. And I feel very honored that you do that. I felt at that time living, and I still live in Ottawa, that it was an incredibly important moment for us in Canada, for various reasons. One of them being that we've typically been very docile and accepting of authority, and now people were finally pushing back in defense of their liberties. Did you share that sense as well?
Absolutely. And one of the things that you said that really struck me, you said, I think it was in another interview that I watched, that you said that on the surface, this is about vaccine mandates, but it's actually a bigger moment. It is about more than that. And I always felt that very deeply as well. The ostensible demand was to get rid of the cross-border vaccine mandates, but I agree that it was a bigger moment, that people were pushing back against, the prime minister's style of managing this pandemic, and just of managing, of doing politics. And as you say, docile Canadians finally had enough. So it was sort of a delicious irony that this happened in Canada, of all places, this convoy. And I actually paired you in a lot of the chapters. I pair, 2 or 3 different people. I paired you with this Rupa Show, MPP from Manitoba. Absolutely stirring speech to the prime minister about how people are suffering. The people in, the farmers, the workers, people are just suffering with these policies, and that we need a plan, we need hope, we need something. It was just a dazzling speech.
Yeah, no, it was a very important moment, and I feel that yes, I remember saying that in several interviews, that it was much more than vaccine mandates. There was something bigger going on here, and I was when I first pointed it out when the convoy was here, I was ridiculed for saying that by establishment journalists, because they thought it was just like a small little gathering of people, and they would just stick around for the weekend and then leave. But that wasn't the case, obviously. And I many critics of the mandates have felt that the pandemic response was driven more by politics than it was by science. I assume that you agree with this view.
Well, I mean, going back to what I said earlier, I actually don't believe that there is a purely scientific response, because science is not prescriptive. There's always going to be values and politics on both sides. Mm-hmm. So I guess, I see that as inevitable.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a purely scientific response. I think both sides have accused the other side of being driven by politics, but I think that what our side, so to speak, felt was really lacking was an appreciation of the downsides, the profound downsides of these policies, and how dehumanizing they were. And I found it interesting that religious people, I talk about that as well in the book, How Religion, I feature Father Raymond D'Souza, who also is a National Post writer. And I'm not religious myself, but I really gained an appreciation for the religious perspective during the pandemic, which I thought was interesting, greater appreciation than before, that, these are people who, they transcend the biomedical worldview, a different view of community, what it means. I also watched a video about the Amish, why they rejected the whole COVID paradigm. I mean, to them, a life without communal worship, without connection, it literally makes no sense. This idea of preserving metabolic life at the expense of everything that gives life meaning just didn't make sense to them. And I really, gained an interesting appreciation for that perspective.
Yeah, no, we're social beings, we're social animals, and for us to live essentially in isolation, and only interact through Zoom and through technology, was just a bit much, very dystopian for sure. And
Yeah, and it seemed to me that some people sensed this and saw it and felt it from the start, and others just
yeah,
didn't, and that's why we had this divide. I
yeah,
always felt the divide was not so much about facts and data as about worldview. You
yeah,
know, there's some people who just they completely embrace the biomedical worldview. You know, so that those are the kinds of things that I explore in the book and that I came to an understanding of, and that's why I also feature philosophers.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and
yeah.
lawyers, a comedian, a priest,
No, it sounds like an amazing book, and again, I encourage our viewers and listeners to get their copy. Now, switching gears a little bit, America's COVID czar Anthony Fauci, who is seen as the official response to the pandemic, spanning both the Trump and Biden administrations. Questions have been raised about some of the ethics behind his recommendation. What is your view of how much blame does he really deserve for the way things played out? And in Fauci, in a recent interview with the New York Times, seemed to be backpedaling a little bit. I was struck by that. How much blame do you think he actually deserves for the way things panned out?
I think quite a lot.
Mm.
Because he, again, the excuse that he and all the other public health advisors gave was, well, our job is just to look at public health, not to look at economy or mental health or socialization or schooling or anything. Our job is to look at public health, and then governments take our advice and combine it with advice from other disciplines. In theory, that should work, but the problem is that the governments basically hopped onto that follow the experts bandwagon. So the government was only listening to these public health experts. They did not bring in experts from these other disciplines to balance the recommendations. And so I think, to me, it seems that someone like Fauci, he had such a huge responsibility, and since the government was just listening to him, I think that somebody with a larger way of thinking would have tried to balance his recommendations more, not just focus on this one nail with his one hammer. And to me, he didn't rise up to that occasion. He was entrusted with this enormous responsibility, but he still approached it kind of like, with a one-track mind.
Yeah.
He had an opportunity to do more,
Yeah, I mean, the media played a big role as well in all of this, of course, basically parroting the official narrative and by punishing dissenting views, calling them conspiracy theorists, anti-science, and even worse. Why do you believe, and you as a journalist, why do you believe that this crucial time, that large sections of our media, both in the US and Canada, fail so miserably by taking what politicians were saying at that time, what politicians and officials were telling them at face value, and not asking the tough questions and not digging deeper?
I guess what comes to mind is, as we all know, we're living in a very polarized society where everyone fears getting canceled. The fear of getting canceled, as you mentioned, for this detransitioner, no matter what your age, if your views depart from the official party line, there is a serious chance of being canceled, a very real chance of losing your employment, and not just your employment, but your future prospects and all these things. And people who have, let's say, family responsibilities or even personal responsibilities and aren't independently wealthy, they legitimately are afraid to go there. And I think that this was one instance where somehow the official narrative became so heavy and dominant. I really, whether journalists and the media articulated consciously or not, I think they just felt that fear. I felt it too, but I think that it helped me in a way being older, because even though I work very much full time, I mean freelance, but I work 7 days a week. it's still different. I no longer have young children to support. And if it came to pass that I lost my job or lost my clients, I could survive. So that's why I don't consider myself superior, in any way for going out and writing essays and writing the book. It's just because I had less to lose, and I realized that I could lose what I had, but it seemed to me that this was the time. This was a time that I had an opportunity to take a stand, and this was the best time. But I think a lot of people in different at different stages of their lives didn't have that luxury.
Yeah. And specifically on lockdowns, the rationale was based on epidemiological models that totally ignored the psychological, economic, and other costs of these policies. And now we have research coming out that shows that, at least in the US, where schools were locked down for longer, kids fell behind in things like math and English. How would you sum up the damage that the lockdowns had on society? And do you think that this generation of young people who started life under lockdowns, are they ever going to recover and have a chance at a normal life?
I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. But I think that the damage is not easily recovered, because certainly in school, once you lose a certain amount of ground, you're unlikely to make it up again, just because you lose the engagement. You're no longer plugged in, and then so it's not like, oh, they can make it up later. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
And I also thought it was so harmful to imply to children that they were responsible for not killing grandma. That whole idea, and I discuss that kind of stuff in the book too. If you transmit a virus accidentally, not through malice, you're not killing anyone. This has been happening since time immemorial. On a planet that's shared by humans and viruses, you are going to get some transmission. Nobody is killing anybody. So this idea that you are killing someone if you give them the virus, I thought that was completely absurd. But again, these ideas took hold, that, and then we told children, well, you have to stay away from this, and you have to wear a mask and do this and not socialize because you don't want to kill your grandma. I mean, what a thing to saddle a child with. And I felt that was a change, that really did represent a change in morality, and not for the better, because it's not a morality that's grounded in biological reality. Of course, we try not to hurt people, we try not to infect people, but we cannot guarantee health. We cannot guarantee freedom from biological harm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Given how damaging all of this has been, Gabrielle, final question to you. Do you think we've learned our lesson? Do you think that whenever the next pandemic or some other apparent emergency arises, you think we'll have a similar knee-jerk reaction to the whole thing?
I guess I'm not entirely optimistic and not entirely pessimistic. I think we've probably absorbed something. And I think that maybe I'd like to think the next time there will be a little more deliberation, and a little more input from various disciplines. But on the other hand, I think that most people probably are still on board with this way of doing things. I don't know if it's 60% or whatever. I think most people are according to me, too willing to throw away liberties that really mean so much and give our lives everything that they mean. People don't appreciate what that is. And so that's a little disturbing to me. So I think there is a possibility that something similar will happen psychologically, to humanity the next time around. And I think that's one of the reasons that I and the many other people who write articles and books about all this, we do it just to, put our drop of water in and to keep the conversation alive, and so that we don't forget, and so that we consider all these other aspects, all the downsides of these types of policies.
Yeah. Well, Gabrielle, on that note, I I really want to thank you for coming onto the show, and I encourage everybody to get a copy of your book. Blindsight is 2020, and I really hope that we don't repeat the mistakes of the last 3 years. Like you, I go between being optimistic and pessimistic. It all depends on the day, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we've actually learned some valuable lessons here, and that there will that there won't be an infringement on our individual liberties and the ostracization of dissenting voices in the future.
Well, I think you're helping a lot in that conversation, that objective. So,
well, I'm trying to do my best, but it's not always easy. But so are you, and that's and it's a great honor to have been featured in your book. And I really hope that you return to the podcast to in sometime in the future to discuss your next book, perhaps.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It was great to chat with you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Yeah, a real pleasure. Thank you.